Hello, my name's Olu Osha, and I like talking about American presidents. And today I want to talk briefly about the increasing significance of the role of women in American politics and, of course, business affairs. If you notice in some of the videos that I started with, I talked about the significance of business to American politics. Of course, in the 19th century, there was the party machine that was basically in the pockets of the robber barons. The robber barons were the big business corporations, and they were, just because of the corruption that they were involved in with the government, they were called robber barons. And of course, even at the beginning, right, the reason we went to we had the Revolutionary Wars was because, of course, remember the Boston Tea Party. It was because of business. Taxes are involved with businesses, right? Taxes back then, in the beginning, we didn't have income tax. Taxes were levied on business, activities. So, the British Crown wanted to tax, tea. There was a Stamp Act to tax printing documents used for printing and things like that. And that was the resistance that the colonists had, and the pretext for wanting to revolt against the British Crown and be independent. Of course, the Virginians are also, they want access to the lands in the West, right? In the Western territories, the British Crown had control of those lands. If they had got independence, then they would have control, right? They'd be able to access the lands west of the colonies. And of course, remember that the Virginia slave holders, they had a lot of loans to British bankers, and of course, if they could get rid of the shackles of the crown and become independent, well, they could just say, well, they're not going to pay those loans. They owned the bankers, right? So business has always been tied to American politics. That's so. Now, as I said, I wanted to talk about the increasing role of women in American politics and business. So in the beginning, women did not have the franchise. They could not vote. And this went into the 19th century. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, did not come into effect until 1920. And of course, we know that black women were still very limited because of Jim Crow laws in the South. And so until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which did away with discrimination. And, it's been a long struggle, right? It's been a long struggle back and forth. But in any event, I was going to just talk about the elections of 1840, right? That brought the campaign that brought William Henry Harrison and his vice president John Tyler to office. They were both on the Whig platform, and interestingly, the Whigs didn't have a manifesto. They didn't have a party manifesto, right? So basically, they didn't want to alienate the voting public, and so they just were anti-Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, who had been vice president of Andrew Jackson, was now president, and so he was the incumbent president. But remember, due to some of the policies of Andrew Jackson, it had caused a panic of 1837, and so there was economic depression in the land. So they were putting all the blame on Martin Van Buren. In fact, he was parodied, he was nicknamed Martin Van Ruin, because the economy was ruined. And so the program of the Whig Party was just being anti-Van Buren, and so they just did everything to ridicule him and whatnot. So that was just, they were just against Martin Van Buren, the incumbent president, and so they looked for a coalition of people who were against the incumbent president, which could be I don't know if we look in modern times, that's probably something that's been done before. I don't know, maybe a coalition of different bodies and groups who are just against an incumbent president. That's a strategy. So The Whig Party did not want to alienate the voting public. Remember that Andrew Jackson, one of the things he'd done was to expand the franchise to, instead of just propertied white men, he made it all white men of a certain age, right? You didn't need property. He had expanded the franchise. So this vote, it was, in fact, the elections of 1840, 1841, it was significant in that it was a prototype of modern campaigning, because this time, again, the candidates didn't use a manifesto, at least the Whig Party, and they focused more on personalities. The campaigning was also, it was wider. It was an appeal to the common man, because the Democratic Party had tried to ridicule William Henry Harrison, who was the front runner. He was the standard bearer for the Whig Party, as being old. Right, he was the oldest president to be elected president at 68 at his time. Of course, he died just a month after. So he also had the shortest tenure as president. So they ridiculed him that, look, this guy is, if you just give him a barrel of cider and put him in a log cabin, he's just going to get drunk, instead of doing his job. And even though William Henry Harrison actually lived in a palatial manse and he wasn't a broke guy, well, I'll do a little thing on him later on. And his vice president, William Tyler, was another wealthy lawyer who slave owning Virginian. They seized on that image to identify with the common man, because the common man lived in a log cabin and hard cider was their favorite brand of beer, right? So they now started, campaigning and using a party slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison was known for winning the Battle of Tippecanoe, and so John Tyler was his vice president. So they went Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and so they brandished the image of him drinking hard cider in a log cabin, and they identified with the common man, and they won. So importantly though, John Tyler also started using women. They used women to campaign heavily for them, even though women couldn't vote at the time. So it was something I wanted to bring out. So it was the first time women were used on a wide scale like this, and for campaigning, even though they still didn't have the votes, and it was successful. Now, I also wanted to, these were white women, and now let me just talk briefly about the affairs of women in American business in the 19th century, in this 1840s. Now, remember, I had talked about Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the only president who was the only vice president, who had who lived openly in a common law marriage with his black slave. She was still his slave. She wasn't free. Importantly, her name was Julia Chin, and she bore two children for him, Imogen and was it Adeline? And that's Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson. He openly acknowledged them as his children. Of course, the laws of the time did not allow him to pass his estates to these daughters, interracial relationship, because they were considered illegitimate, and so they couldn't inherit his property, his estate. In fact, his brothers inherited his estate, even though he did give them money while he was alive. He educated them, and it was a reason why I suppose Martin Van Buren did not use him as his running mate on his second run for president, because there was this widespread antagonism towards Richard Mentor Johnson for living openly with his his slave. as a common law wife. As a, she was his concubine. It would, again, it was something that the society just didn't advertise at the time, even though yes, it was an open secret that slave owners did sleep with their female slaves. Now, I don't like using that word slave, but that's just it's historical. Enslaved persons, I don't know. The thing is, and another reason it's concerning for me, because I've noticed many Black Americans, they start their history from slavery in America. These were Africans, and the Africans who were kidnapped and brought here, many of them were not even slaves. They were not slaves from where they were. Some of them were kings, were princes. They were just the victims of war, and it's just it's I don't know. It's concerning. It's disturbing. That so much of their history to them, it's been wiped off, and their history. They start their story from being an ancestor being a slave, from slavery and everything that happened in slavery. And yes, it's jarring, but yeah, like I was just basically saying that I find it disturbing, just referring to people as slaves. I guess enslaved persons, but hey, history is history. And so Julia Chin managed the estate of Vice President Mentor. When he was away, when he traveled, she managed his estate. She supervised other slaves, and so this is the controversial and complex relationships, that occurred in the institution of slavery. So you see, and even within the African American community, you hear them using terms like the house slave and the field slave. And so obviously the house slave are those mixed, or those slaves that were cohabiting with the slave master, and they often had, of course, they were more favored than those slaves in the field. And so you see that the role of Julia Chin, who was a slave herself, but she was in a relationship. She was a concubine of her slave master, who was Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson, and so she was supervising other slaves as well. So it was a very complex and jarring institution, and it caused a lot of division. So you can see people of the same ethnic group being divided, because one's obviously aligned with the master in inflicting, harm and exploitation on them. Becomes the instrument, the tool of course, so Julia Chin becomes a tool of the oppression, inflicting oppression on, the field slaves. But Julia Chin herself is not in the relationship by choice. This is duress. I once read, I watched a documentary of a woman who wrote a horrible book about the relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. I've never read the book, but I heard her discussing it, the book. She's discussing it as if it was a romantic relationship. It was something that Sally Hemings went into lovingly. She's romanticizing rape and abuse and exploitation. And so these enslaved women obviously were in their relationship was under duress. It was not something that they chose. And we're seeing a lot of these things still happen today. In my relationship with Montgomery County, Maryland, they've tried to use duress on me. Of course, I was assaulted in my home by Montgomery County Police based on a lie. They've used duress, and they use falsified, fabricated, documents, supposedly carrying the weight of law. Like a female judge, a black female judge, Judge Bibi Berry, she incompetently, finds probable cause in a document that's poorly filled out, that a document that's of perjury, that's fabricated, and so you're seeing this is a black woman being exploited. When she saw the name, she saw this was a black person. But I wonder what sort of mind, what she was going through, what she was thinking of, that she couldn't consider that this might be some kind of fallacy going on, this might be a lie. She's authorizing that somebody's 14th Amendment rights should be taken away. An adult, you know. And so it's jarring, you know. I was just thinking about how the psychology of the enslaved changes completely. That there's this Stockholm syndrome that becomes a part of them. Stockholm syndrome is where an abused person identifies with the abuser, and they become trapped, and they sort of virtually fall in love with their abuser. I was reading about the American Colonization Society, and of course James Monroe was instrumental, and James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, because while all these presidents were slave owners themselves, but they always expressed horror about the institution, and they hoped that one day it would be abolished, right? But they believed in the inferiority, or at least they espoused they asserted the inferiority, alleged inferiority of Africans, of their slaves, and so they didn't believe they could coexist freely with white people, that there will still be that master inferior relationship. And so they said if they ever freed slaves, they need to send them, repatriate them somewhere else, send them, deport them to Africa. So that was the reason they founded Liberia, and Monrovia, it's its capital, named after James Monroe. So in fact, they would have conditions. Thomas Jefferson, many of them, they would have conditions that, look, if they freed any slaves, that they would only be free on condition that they wouldn't live in America, but they would go back to Africa and settle there. So you see this. So even though they were giving these conditions, some of the freed slaves of the time, so they became freedmen. First, slave was freed through manumission. That's where a slave owner, privately frees his slave, uses legal documents and everything, formally frees his slave through manumission. There was a condition that they would not live in America, but they'd go back to Africa. They'd go away. Some of those slaves said no. The freedmen, the people who became freedmen, who could go to anywhere, they could go to Canada, they could go to Massachusetts, because those were free states. They said no, they didn't want to go back to Africa. So only a few people, I think maybe just about 5,000 or less, ended up going to Africa through manumission, and through repatriation back to Africa, with the help of the American Colonization Society. And the U.S. government did fund them. It wasn't an official U.S. government agency or anything like that, but the U.S. government provided them funding to effect the transportation and settling. So that was the situation of women in the 1840s. They didn't, it was a patriarchal society then, and they didn't have the vote. So, but we see that in the campaign of William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, they used women extensively for campaigning, and of course, in their business affairs, you saw some, black female slaves like Julia Chin, who was a concubine of her slave master, Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson. She was his business associate or whatever, unpaid business associate. She managed his businesses, including supervising his slaves, his enslaved persons. And so until the 20th century, 1920, when women would eventually get voting rights. And of course 1965, when the Voting Rights Act would fully extend, fully embrace all black women of a certain age. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about US presidents, and I also use the opportunity to talk about my wrongful detention and through subornation of perjury and fraud on the courts at Montgomery County, Maryland. The case number C15CR23000731. It's a bad faith prosecution. abusive process has occurred in order to impede federal government investigations into fraud and misconduct in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.